So, the Elizabeth Smart case is when faith, fear, and the law collided. So, in June of 2002, a quiet neighborhood in Salt Lake City became the center of a case that would grip an entire nation. A 14-year-old girl vanished from her home in the middle of the night, taken by a man who claimed divine authority. Her name was, of course, Elizabeth Smart, and what followed would challenge assumptions about survival control and ultimately the legal justice system. So the Smart family was asleep, and sometime during the night, a man enters the home and he wakes Elizabeth and forces her out at knife point. So we want to look at this case from a legal point of view. Obviously, it's good to have some background contextual knowledge about exactly what happened and unfolded in that horrific night. But beyond the headlines, there is a case that became a particularly complex legal study, one that tested the boundaries of competency law, coercion doctrines, and federal kidnapping statutes, which is so immensely important. So let's start with the legal foundation. What were the charges? So, how did this case ultimately end? She was rescued, and the primary defendant was named Brian David Mitchell. He was prosecuted under federal law, not just state law. Why, you may ask? Because he crossed into the federal jurisdiction due to the transportation areas under federal authority and the nature of the offense. She was a minor. She was a 14-year-old girl. So this statute allowed federal prosecutors to pursue severe penalties, including life imprisonment. Now let's look at, to secure a conviction, what did the prosecutors have to do to ensure that he would pay for his heinous and notorious crimes? Also, to add, his wife was also involved. We'll get to her in a little bit later. So, unlawful seizure or confinement, transportation or holding of the victim against the victim's will, of course, and for an unlawful purpose. She was assaulted, brutalized, terrorized, and the amount of trauma this woman may be holding. She is now a mother, but she has been through so much and she is immensely strong, so we must recognize that factor, but we can bring that up in court, right? So at first glance, this seems straightforward, but the defense would later challenge one critical point. Was the victim truly acting against her will throughout the entire period? Now, to us, we would say, yeah, of course. But since this man was a person who she had met previously, they kind of twisted the whole story around, and that is where the case became legally significant. The defense leaned into a dangerous sort of gray area, if you will, suggesting that public appearances without escape attempts could imply compliance, but the prosecution reframed the issue using the coercive control. So, under legal interpretation, consent is invalid if obtained through threats of harm, psychological domination, and manipulation of belief systems. So, in this case, the court recognized that control doesn't require chains, it can be enforced through fear and conditioning. And there's actually certain theories like Pavlov's classical conditioning study or Skinner's operant conditioning research that shows that we can learn to comply through these different ways. And that's exactly what happened. That's why she didn't feel like she could have escaped. She was literally psychologically trapped. Now we get to the most delayed and most critical legal issue. For years, proceedings stalled because Brian David Mitchell was deemed incompetent to stand trial. Now we see this a lot, but under American law, competency requires the defendant to understand the nature of the proceedings and they can consult with their counsel rationally. This is standard and it comes from several cases like Dusky v. United States, etc. Mitchell's behavior, his religious outbursts, and his refusal to cooperate raised key legal questions. Was this genuine mental illness or strategic noncompliance? How do we know? Where do we draw that line? I think this case is perfect to dive deep into that specific problem. So eventually, after extensive psychological evaluations, the court ruled him competent to stand trial, allowing it to proceed. Once in trial, the defense had limited options. They did not successfully establish legal sanity, lack of intent, or mistaken identity. Instead, their arguments struggled against consistent victim testimony, corroborating physical evidence, and witness identification. That is key. So in 2010, the jury returned the guilty verdict, thank God, and Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to life imprisonment under federal law, and his wife, which I said we would talk about, Wandera Barzee, entered a plea agreement, highlighting another pathway, another legal pathway. So the plea bargaining in exchange for reduced sentencing, yet she still was sentenced to time in prison. So this case leaves us with several critical legal principles. Competency can delay justice but safeguards fairness. Consent is legally invalid under coercion, and victim behavior is not a reliable indicator of freedom. I cannot stress that point enough. And federal statutes allow broader prosecutorial reach in severe crimes like this one. So the Elizabeth Smart case is not just a story of survival. It is a case study that shows and portrays how the legal system defines control, responsibility, and justice. And in law, those definitions matter. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and let me know if you guys have specific cases in mind you want me to cover next. Bye-bye.